Factus was chosen from thousands of manuscripts that went to Grey Wolf Press. And what do you think you're doing differently that causes your voice to rise above all those other thousands? I mean, when I read the book, I saw some things that I thought were, um, exceptional things I'm not always seeing in other poets right now. What do you think made yours stand out?
Absolutely. I think um hmm, it's that's a very good question. Obviously, I think as you pointed out, they when they took my book from an open reading period where they had received, I think, over 2,000 manuscripts, um, I waited obviously a little over a year to hear back from them. And I can imagine the process was very difficult. And I say this because I know friends who also submitted their manuscripts, and I knew how strong their work was. Um, I find myself I found myself in a situation where, as a Honduran poet, um, especially as a diasporic Honduran poet, I didn't really find, I barely found poetry mentors, idols, anything like that within my communities. I mean, most of the people that I aspired to were people who, had been writing at the turn of the century, or um, they were writing like very early on. Um, I knew that one of the reasons that made this book urgent was the fact that we don't really have a book from Honduras, especially from a press like Grey Wolf. So I knew that that was unique in itself. Um, I also knew that writing a book from the perspective of a queer person, who also dealt with a lot of challenges in Miami, that would also provide a very unique angle. And I say that because many people of my generation, if they finish high school, they didn't continue to college, and if they continue into college, a lot of them stayed at home. And so I knew that my experience of having to, not just leave Honduras, but then also moving out of Florida, to go to my undergrad in Chicago, and then living in New Hampshire, and all of these different things. I knew that I had been exposed to so many different communities and languages in the US. And so I felt like if the book had a chance, it needed to be true to those sort of to that journey that I've been through. And that's always it's very difficult to write about. It's very difficult to write about living in so many different places, because it always feels like you're starting a new community. You're starting, with a new set of friends. Um, and I know that personally that affected me. I think that in writing the book, it almost seemed like a Tower of Babel type of
Mm, yeah.
journey, where there's all of these different things coming in, not just from the queer neighborhoods and the communities that I've been a part of, but also the fact that I'm contending with issues on a global scale and also on a local scale. So I think that for me at least, it's what made the work unique, and very much pertinent to my own life.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So in the poems, you address a long list of concerns, and sometimes you just use one single phrase or line to sort of embody a much larger issue. For example, in the Alapata Branch Library, you have a line, a fill in the Brown Inmate Correctional Center. I mean, there's a whole big giant issue right in that one little part of a line. And you do it again in Arthur's Spelling Trouble, where you talk about they're not looking for brown minds, but brown war machines. So even though the poem is not overall about that subject, you bring that in. Do you work on these lines to make sure they embody those entire issues in a nutshell, or Is it because everything is so intersectional anyway, that as you're writing a poem, it arises from within what you're writing about?
I love that question. I think it's both, both and also more. I would say that in terms of these questions or these sort of what feel like rhetorical, highly poetic, reflective moments in the poems, um, I definitely know that um, they, in the writing process at least, they rise from that, those conversations that I'm having. Um, and I think that for me, that's the whole process of what poetry feels like to me, right? That um, sometimes my work is incredibly um, it's incredibly intertextual, and it's also like it's got a lot of non sequiturs, right? So there's like it's highly populated with words, highly populated with sounds and even people. And then for me, at least, what that does is that it starts creating this energy from which these questions then sort of explode from that. It's funny that you ask about those moments because there's a moment. This is something that happens in my great grandmother's Egg Thief on page 13, where um, I'm talking about my grandmother, my great grandmother, right? And then I'm talking about my grandmother, and then I'm talking about my grandfather, and all of these different things. And I go into like this whole situation of like feminism, and I talk about like stealing eggs and all, and this one scenario of this man who stole 700 rare wild bird eggs, right? And um, it's interesting because then I go into this whole like echoing of the commandments, where it says like, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And I'm both in those two moments. It feels like to me that I'm going into moments of the the influence that Christianity at least had in our everyday lives, in my everyday life, when it comes to the issue of my grandmother leaving my grandfather to take care of these, to raise these children, and then for her to leave with another man, like something so unheard of, at the time. At the same time that I'm dealing with this question of theft, and then I go into this question of how do you return everything you've stolen from us? And it's interesting because a lot of people who perhaps might not stop there to read that question, one of the biggest things that I'm asking about in this question of theft and whatnot is the idea of like the process of what does it mean to return artifacts and things like that to the rightful owners and heirs of those objects. And that's a question that I think happens not just on a personal level, right? The idea of returning something you stole or that you inherited that you don't want anymore because it doesn't, either it doesn't serve you or you just realize that it was never meant for you. But then this is a question that comes up a lot when it comes to the question of museums. And I love museums, and I've been highly influenced by museums and the process of curation. But this is one of those moments where I think so much about like decolonizing, spaces. I think about reparations, for instance. I think about, and this is already happening recently, where artifacts are being like given back to the countries that were, the West stole them from. And then it's also happening in terms of the land, where most recently there was a case, and I forget the details, but a portion of land was returned to an indigenous nation. And so it's all of these things that I'm thinking about. And of course, as you keep reading, I I make it aware that I make the reader aware that my great grandmother, had all this, land stolen from her as well. And so these are questions that I feel like, again, they feel rhetorical, but they're highly you brought up the word intersectional, they're highly intersectional. And they can only come about, in my case, from the friction that all of these different sort of materials create.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is one of my favorite poems. I've got little Post-its on quite a few of them, and that one definitely has a Post-it.
Thank you.
I really loved the Rita. I really loved her.
Yeah, Rita was she's a huge influence in my life, and I talk about her all the time. In fact, I was talking about her I think just yesterday with my partner, because we were talking about the question of owning land and owning property. And I was basically saying that, despite what I do in my everyday life, I fundamentally believe in stewardship with the land. And so I feel like, because I believe in stewardship with the land, the question of owning land feels very much like a contradiction within that framework. And so, and for me, that's important, because when it comes to questions of housing, which is very much relevant to people in Honduras, but it's also relevant to people, homeless kids who are queer, trans, around the world. That to me is both a political and also poetic question.
Good, thank you. I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about form in the poems in Catrachos, and there's a huge variety. Some of your poems are a block of text with slash marks used to mark line breaks, that would be used if they were being quoted in prose, and several other poems are written in couplets. Do you decide to use a particular form, or does the form arise as you're writing a poem? Do you just look back at a poem you've already written and say, hey, that might be better in couplets? Or how do you work with form?
Yeah, the form is something that very much emerges from the writing process. Even, I've been mentioning my great grandmother's Egg Thief this morning, and this poem, to get at how it's got all these like extra, indentations, stanzas, right? This is something that came after several drafts. The title poem, right? Catrachos on page 1. This is also a form that did not come up until very late in the writing process. It was a poem that at the very beginning it zigzagged, throughout the page and whatnot. And for me, at least, like, there's something about that particular version versus how it ended up that I kept trying to find a form, or the poem at least kept trying to find a form that felt less poetic and felt more like a portrait, so like that's how you end up with this like chunk of text that is perfectly what's the word, it's perfectly like squared. There's something like that also happens with the Quinceañera poem. And this is on page, Quinceañera comes up on page 53, where again, that was a very, very different form than how it ended up being. And one of the things that I think about, especially with Quinceañera, is like the question of like a plot of land where you end up finding in this case, like a body that's been beheaded, right? And so for that, I was thinking about a plot of land. There are other forms throughout the poem, as you pointed out, throughout the book, One of them is, of course, Self-Portrait according to George W. Bush. And that one, it felt like it needed to almost be this form that felt both journalistic, and also it felt like it would, again, that it would incorporate all these sort of like found text, right, from this particular speech. But then we get to on page 72, the section that has the Chinese takeout menu. That was a form that did not happen until way later in the writing and revision process, where I kept thinking about this space, this restaurant. What are the materials within that space that could also be useful in terms of opening up other conversations and possibilities about this space? And the question of like both on documentation, women's work, multi-ethnicity, and the menu becomes this. It became this moment where I said, I have to contend with the menu, right? And then as I was thinking about contending with the menu, I was thinking very much about my many experiences with Chinese takeout. And then it dealt into my, questions about like my GI, issues that I've had for most of my life. And so there's a lot that comes up through that form that I didn't even think about until much later in the revision process. I was gonna say that the boxes of text, like from Quinceañera and Catrachos, I was looking for the word justified, that they're perfectly justified.
Yeah. The ones where, like in Marrow and like in Quinceañera, when you have the line breaks that are put in all throughout the line, it seemed to me as a reader like you were inviting me to almost reform the poem several different ways and experiment with different endings and line breaks in my mind. And I spent quite some time with those poems because I read them, but then I wanted to go back and read it with the suggested line breaks. And is that the kind of experience you were hoping to give the reader, or did that just happen surreptitiously?
Yeah, I think that, that's a very good question. And I wish we had this conversation while I was revising these poems, because that could have been such a cool thing, especially because I feel very much like I've been highly influenced by, Dare's poetry, for instance, Dare's art. And so they would totally have done something like that. I think for me, those slashes, they're absolutely something that I learned while working on the Restore Mural for Orlando poem, where I thought, how does one put together or restore, right, this picture, this image, this portrait that has been shattered by violence? And because violence in many ways can be a random act versus a very much premeditated, and I think that in Restore Mural for Orlando is very much premeditated. I wanted to bring that sense of premeditation with almost the stateliness of like the couplets throughout the poem, but then I wanted to have those slashes as a way to bring attention to the fragmentation of what does it mean to restore this, and then the violence, right, that continues to plague us. Those slashes work differently in Quinceañera. In Quinceañera, we're talking about literal mutilation of someone. Right. In Catrachos, the slashes, I think more of them as the question of what happens when a person who's, trans or queer ends up, having to almost split their own identity into something that is more accepted by a heteronormative society. And so with catrachos, the slashes, are they're functioning in terms of memory, fragmentation of memory. There's a moment in that poem that says, where, my aunt, it says, like, she pulls me by the hair in the house, she unfastens my belt, strikes me with it. And then it says, a newborn island on my cheek, the ghost of another body, my body. Those slashes are very much in terms of like depersonalization, right? They're also functioning in that like brutalizing someone's body enough that they end up creating a new kind of identity, a new sort of like even spirit, I would say, or a fragmented spirit. That's something that I've learned very much from Carmen Maria Machado. The, like, again, the haunting versus the body, right? The body that suffered, the body that's been corrupted, if that's one way of putting it. Yeah, I think about that a lot. So one of the, in your question, when you were talking about like the, almost like a Jenga kind of thing, I didn't think about that, but I can very well see how that could be even possible. Again, it's the fragmentation and then putting back this fragmentation.
Wonderful. It's really, and it's going to make me go back and reread those poems now, and in light of what you've said, and I think it gives them even more depth.
Thank you.
You did an interview with Bomb magazine, and you said that you felt it was okay to start a poem in a space of discomfort. And how did that discomfort?
Yeah.
How did that feeling, the willingness to create discomfort, affect you or the poems that you wrote once you felt that that was okay? And what do you think it does for readers when they start in a place of discomfort?
Yeah, I think so. The caveat is that therapy is necessary, right? When one is, or at least like a very strong support group, a core of people that can allow you to do that. One of my former professors back in at Miami-Dade College, she used to love the poet Rimbaud. And, I love Rimbaud too. And she basically, one of the things that she used to say is that for Rimbaud to have written the kind of work he did, especially at such a young age, Verlaine, acted as a kind of anchor, and I kept, and one of the things that we kept thinking about is like the dynamic of someone holding a rope, or, to ground themselves, and then, they're walking, and then the rope is also attached to them, and they're walking into sort of like very unknown spaces, right? And so they're constantly, there's like this, it's like an echo, right? Like they're having this conversation of how far, should you go? And this is, of course, a motif that comes up in other, places. I think about it in one of my favorite, horror films, Poltergeist, right? Like the going into the sort of the static of the TV. It's come up recently in this show that I don't know if you've watched. It's called Lovecraft Country, and there's, again, that idea of someone holding onto stable ground, and then you can go and into unknown regions. I'm bringing that up because I think that the discomfort, starting from a place of discomfort, isn't, of course, easy. And there's two questions that I'm thinking about in regards to your question. One is the discomfort something that is the place of discomfort the place where one started writing from, like the poem,
Mhm.
or the place of discomfort is something that in the revision process one decided to bring that idea of discomfort or that image of discomfort towards the very beginning of the poem as a way to cue the reader into understanding what kind of contract we're making. And I think it's for me, I think it's both. I think discomfort is something that is important for me to talk about because as a child, um, as someone who was essentially exposed to what we call the sovereign's, forms of violence, right? What we call the, heterosexist violence, poverty, things like that. Um, I was never given, unfortunately, any sort of content warnings, right? I wholeheartedly believe in content warnings. I think that they're important for anyone who needs them. But in my experience, unfortunately, no one asked me that. And so the child, or at least like me growing up as a child here in the US, and even in Honduras, I I was exposed to a lot of uncomfortable situations and forms of violence and oppression, forms of oppression. And so I think that if I'm going to be also honest about those experiences, I have to figure out a way, craft wise, form wise, that also puts the reader in that sort of, maybe even whiplash kind of space. Um, the Catrachos, right, the poem that opens the book, is very much a space of discomfort. And that's something that I have to think about. My press, Jeff Schatz, Ireland, my other editor too, they went along with my gut feelings, right? They wanted to make sure that if this is the runway show that I'm putting on, that at least all the costumes and all the things that I'm gonna put out there were well sewn and stitched and et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of putting that poem at the very beginning for me was very important because I said, if the reader can get through this and still be intrigued by what may come after, that's the reader I want. If the reader is put off by this, they're going to have a difficult time with the rest of the book, regardless of how more readable or more comprehensible, discerning the poems are in other parts of the book. So yeah, discomfort is very much a question of queerness. At the same time, it's a question that also, for me as a dancer, as a trained dancer, there's discomfort in even putting a performance of beauty. I think about it, with the amount of training that one has to go through, the kinds of things that you have to put your body through as a way to, again, put on this performance, put on the magic, of the show. So I very much believe in that. I believe that it's something that's very much in conversation with what it's like to be an immigrant, what it's like to be, queer, what it's like to come from a very specific, place of or places of violence. And yeah, and it's the fact that, like, at least for me, discomfort also comes up in my everyday life when it comes to like employment, when it comes to going to the store, when it comes to, how am I made to feel in spaces where I'm trying to be my true self.
In another interview, you said that writing this book healed you in some ways. And I'm wondering if addressing that discomfort is part of what healed you, and if there were other aspects of the book that felt healing to you.
Absolutely. I probably I probably wrote upwards of 500 poems or so before I landed on the poems that, became this book. And so many of those, what people would call false attempts, for me were very much attempts at trying to hone in on a language that I felt comfortable in, that I felt could also push me to try out new things and to talk about my own experiences. But the writing process became therapeutic in many ways. Being able to write about things that I never had the language for. I think that it's a very different experience. This is why I think therapists and psychoanalysts and art therapists like talk so much about the benefits of writing it down. I find that if I let these things continue to percolate in my head, um, it often can lead down very dark rabbit holes. Whereas if I can write it down, it it doesn't make the trauma go away, but it allows me to name it. It allows me to name the monster. It allows me to name the what was triggering. And once I'm able to do that, I'm able to then start thinking about living. If I'm able to name the monster, then I'm able to say, how and when do I make space for the monster? For my mind to think about that. When do I then say, you know what, we've done our monster work for today. Now it's time to, for self-care. So no, you're absolutely right that the process of identification for me, through the writing process, was very helpful.
Good, good. You've spoken about working on a memoir, which I'm sure would then delve back into some of that territory. And you've also said you wanted to maybe someday start a TV series or a comic book series. And I love comic book series, so that was intriguing. So what are you working on now, or what can we look forward to in terms of a future book or books or series from you?
Sure. In terms of like where I'm pitching this work, I can't say much because, you know, um, with all of these places, they want to see the work instead of like talking
Yeah,
about the work.
right, right.
Yeah, but I definitely have been thinking a lot about YA books. In As I was revising Catrachos, I noticed that the book was very much a book that tried to bring attention to suffering that children go through. And so I've been thinking about a YA book that is in conversation with Catrachos. There's an idea that I have about a children's book too. I can draw. I don't know how comfortable I feel making the art for something like this, but it would be a whole different challenge. Um, and I've also, as you pointed out, I mean, I've been thinking about a short story collection. There's several short stories I've written that if I probably write two more, I might have a short story collection. But that's a whole other kind of space for me that feels very vulnerable.
Mm.
And I haven't often gone back to that space because um, in a pandemic, and having to go through graduate school, like I'm going through right now, there are so many other things that have been pulling my attention. I think my main task, that or challenge that I have to deal with, especially as we approach a new year, is thinking more about better time management. And what that means is starting more from a space of self-care first, then care for my art, and then thinking about all of these other things, because it's so easy, especially, you know, with this book. There's been so much work around it, and you know, it's hard to know, especially in this pandemic, what sticks, right? What has not, you know, stuck. um, I love doing interviews because I think that the interviews have allowed me to really be more reflective about this journey, and also like how can I be more intentional with future projects. But at the same time, you know, I really want to get back to that world of doing, you know, in-person readings and being in that space again. So I'm really looking forward to that and trying out new material in that kind of space.
One question before we go. I don't want to take too much of your time, but
Thank you.
I was very interested in the notes that are part of your book, and that's the first time I've seen that used to that extent in a book, and I was very grateful for it. And I mentioned earlier your book seemed so generous, and that's one of the pieces of it that I felt was a generous thing to provide for your reader, because there are so many pop culture references and things that people, if they're not part of a community, might not understand. And you really help your readers get all those references that are encoded into the poems. Did you think about doing that as you were going into the book or partway through, or is that something that when you look back over your completed manuscript, you went, wait a minute, I better explain some of these things or they won't really always get exactly what I'm talking about?
Sure, that's an excellent question. A lot of the in one of the earlier versions of the manuscript, some of this information appeared as like epigraphs, or sometimes they appeared at the end of a poem. And one of the conversations I kept having with my editors was how useful is it to have all that information side by side with the poem, right? Is there a way that the reader can enjoy the poem first and then through the notes go back to this work? And I think with the notes, I felt like I was walking a very fine line. There's the danger, right, of what we call translating your own culture for mass consumption, which I didn't want to do. Instead, I wanted to provide ways for people to engage with these poems, see all of these openings, right? All of these threads that are happening in the poems. And in many ways, you know, run with that research, right? So I'm thinking that it's less, at least for me, it's less about understanding, or what we call understanding the poem, and more about thinking about all the ways that poetry can engage with other media. I recently was asked that question about if I'm more invested, or how invested I am in my readers understanding my work. And for me, is I'm more invested in my readers feeling the work. And I'm more invested in readers sort of being lured into the work through the sounds, through the cadences, through the language, through the imagery, than I am at like this understanding, because I feel like I think that there's a Western, I would say, propensity that the minute you understand something, you can then categorize it and then it's dead. And for me, I'm like, no, a lot of this work is still very much work that I continue to come back to. You know, a lot of the questions that I ask in my book are questions that I continue to go back to. So it's not a dead process. It's not a process of decoding something so that you can, move on. I think for me, it's a process of what possibilities exist in this work that I might not even be aware of, that readers might find even more intriguing, right? To sort of pursue. And so these lines of possibility, right, to use more academic language, like these lines of possibilities, I wanted the notes to do that, right? Like, okay, now that you've read about these like crimes committed by the Catholic Church, what are some ways that you can continue to explore advocacy venues, right? Advocacy work around this. Now that you've looked at things like, for instance, pop culture, Cantinflas, I mentioned, and Selena. What are some ways that you can do your own sort of reflective work and check out one of their movies or check out, their music? That's what I'm more interested in, right? Almost like having these poems act like prompts in your own life rather than being like, look, this is what it's like being a Honduran. I don't want that to be the conversation. I want this to be, as a Honduran, right? Here are ways that you can go into your own sort of journeys.
And that is the way they felt to me, like that you were decoding your own personal experience, which comes from so many aspects of who you are in life. And I did read the entire book through before I read the notes. In fact, I didn't even know they were there. I just sort of was reading through. And then when I discovered the notes, of course, I went back and looked at the various poems and reread them. But I'm glad I didn't know they were there. And I just read them and felt them,
Yeah, that's even something that was very purposeful with the note on the title, where I had to ask myself, do I really need people to know what catrachos means from the get-go? Or what happens if they read it, perhaps not even knowing what this is, and then you get to the end and then you go, oh goodness, like there are different ways of reading this book. I'm more invested in that. And I know that this is, other writers may have a very different relationship to that. Like they want to make sure that their terms are defined from the get-go so that the reader isn't necessarily quote unquote lost. But for me, it's like, if the reader gets lost, let them get lost, right? Like, what's at stake, right? Like that they got lost and, perhaps they'll lose interest, or that they'll continue to dive into the book and then figure out that there's like a far more rich experience than they originally thought. Like that to me is more gratifying. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Roy. This has been wonderful. And I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thank you so much, Judy. Take care.
You too.